With the United States and Israel's latest war on Iran, we have to ask, if the United States can attack countries, ignore the UN, sideline Congress, and absorb the fallout, then what is actually left of the international system that was built after World War II? That question is getting louder as Donald Trump's war in Iran drags on. And Iran is not an isolated case. Since returning to office in January 2025, Trump has not only launched a war on Iran, he has also ordered an attack on Venezuela, threatened to annex Greenland, undermine the United Nations, strained alliances with Europe, and used tariffs as a foreign policy weapon. Taken together, this shows a presidency acting less like it's bound by law and more is bound by political convenience. Trump himself suggested as much back in January, when he said the real limit on his power was his own morality.
Do you see any checks on your power on the world stage? Is there anything that could stop you if you wanted to?
Yeah, there's one thing, my own morality, my own mind. It's the only thing that can stop, and that's
law.
very good. I don't need international law.
The legal position is pretty clear. The illegality of US-Israeli strikes on Iran is pretty clear. Look, you have a fundamental principle of the UN Charter, the cornerstone really of the UN Charter is Article 2.4, which is this blanket ban on the use of force, on the use of military force against another state. It's the cornerstone of the entire post-Second World War international order. And essentially, the language that it uses that prohibits member states from using force against the territorial integrity or political independence of another state. And so that's pretty, comprehensive in that regard. And there are only two exceptions here. The first is self-defense under Article 51. So if a state attacks you, a state is committing a crime of aggression against you, then in self-defense you are allowed, and that too, only to the extent that it thwarts the attack on you, you're allowed to use force in that defense. And the second is, actions authorized by the UN Security Council. Now, interestingly, Washington did not go to the Security Council, even though, its own allies, France, for example, said that this is something that should have been debated at the Security Council, and authorization should have been sought in this way. That hasn't been the case. The US struck Iran's nuclear facilities last year. You remember those bunker buster missiles over Fordo and a number of other locations with the Israelis, and that was done without Security Council authorization. And then now, in February of this year, February 28th, just a few weeks ago, the US launched the attack that is ongoing, and that's been far more devastating. It's a joint attack with Israel. It killed Iran's supreme leader Khamenei and targeted government buildings, military sites, oil infrastructure, schools and hospitals. In Venezuela, the US forces, they seized a sitting president, President Maduro. Now, none of this was authorized by the Security Council. None of this was sanctioned by international law as such. Washington's likely legal argument rests on preventive, or what we call, anticipatory self-defense. The idea that Iran's nuclear program posed an imminent and existential threat, if you will. Trump administration also pointed to, alleged Iranian plans to strike US targets on American soil. But here's the problem. International law sets a very high standard for anticipatory self-defense. The threat must be instant, overwhelming, and leave no real choice to the state. It has to basically use force to defend itself under the circumstances. Now, a nuclear program that even American intelligence agencies say is, a decade away or several years away, and to couple that with, having the ability to deliver that, having an intercontinental ballistic missile that can deliver this to the US, that is, many, many years away. It is not imminent, and it is not overwhelming at all. And secondly, there's no credible evidence of an imminent Iranian attack that's ever been made public. In fact, we're hearing the opposite, that the US intelligence community said that Iran did not plan to attack the US. In fact, Iran was in the middle of negotiations with the US. And it is this perfidy really that the US has been involved in, that it lured Iran into negotiations and then struck them. And this is not the first time. The same thing happened in June last year, where they were in the midst of negotiations and an attack happened. What we're seeing is that the legal justification, in the eyes of most international lawyers, most experts in this area, is very, very weak for the US.
So far, it hasn't. Both attacks on Iran and Venezuela violated the UN Charter, especially Article 2.4, which prohibits the use of force against other states except in very limited circumstances. But the problem is simple. International law has rules but weak enforcement when the violator is the most powerful country in the world. For years, critics said the rules-based order often served Western interests anyway. Now, even with the appearance of restraint seems to be falling away.
This is really the heart of the matter, if you will, and it exposes what international lawyers call the structural flaw in the international legal system, and that is the enforcement gap. Really, how do you enforce the rules on the mighty and powerful? In theory, there are several mechanisms. The UN Security Council, that is your primary body that deals with international peace and security, and so that, technically speaking, is authorized to deal with this thing. But the problem is, the US is on the Security Council, and the US carries a veto. So even if all the other countries, combined to take collective action against the US here, the US could simply veto it, and so that gridlock would be there, as it currently is in the UN Security Council. You can have the International Court of Justice take up a case, and rule on state responsibility or the illegality of US actions here and its violation of the UN Charter. But again, the enforcement mechanism, if a state doesn't voluntarily comply, is through the UN Security Council, even for ICJ decisions. And again, we fall into the same trap where the US can easily veto this. If for subsequent crimes, if the US is committing war crimes, the International Court of Justice could take up a case if the prosecutor feels that it's necessary, especially in cases where a member state of the ICC has been attacked. So if attacks take place on their territory, if war crimes take place on their territory by US forces, then US forces could be held accountable. The problem is that the US has already sanctioned ICC judges, and they have something under US domestic law, which is one of my favorite laws that's ever been passed, is the Hague Invasion Act, which basically states that if any US military personnel or any US citizen is held in the International Criminal Court, that the US government is obligated to invade The Hague in the Netherlands and rescue that individual to prevent the ICC from having a trial of that individual. So they've got that going as well. You can also technically have the General Assembly pass a resolution. There are a number of issues. It's morally binding, not legally binding, so it really doesn't have that. States can impose sanctions, and in theory, universal jurisdiction could apply, where states, there are some countries that have, their legal system allows for the trial of criminals who have committed crimes in other jurisdictions or in other countries abroad. And so these individuals, even if they're not citizens, depending on the severity of the crime, the type of crime that it is, those crimes could be tried, especially international crimes like war crimes or crimes against humanity, genocide. These types of crimes could be then tried within that country. Now, again, that's a huge diplomatic risk, political risk that any country would be taking. So in practice, when it comes, when the state in question is the United States, permanent member of the Security Council with a veto, most of these mechanisms, they're going to collapse immediately. And even though we've seen Russia and China condemn the strikes, they haven't really taken any real action beyond that. And any Security Council resolution authorizing a response would be vetoed immediately by Washington. And so that's the paralysis there. So the main body that deals with these issues is paralyzed. What remains, is your General Assembly resolution. It carries moral weight, doesn't really have any legal enforcement. There could be economic pressure or sanctions from allies, but the US is often the biggest trading partner of most countries that deal with it. So that is a serious concern. I mean, knowing how vindictive the US administration, the current US administration is, I don't think they're going to take that lightly, and they certainly have a lot more levers to pull on many other countries than the other way around. There's always long-term reputational damage, and that's something that definitely will impact the US. The US is proving to be an unreliable partner, an irrational actor, really. It went into this in a very harsh way. It is a country that the Russians call, unable to really abide by their agreements that they have. So even, the JCPOA that they had with Iran previously, Trump tore that up. It was a US government, US state-backed agreement, and another administration comes in and just pulls out of it. despite its massive success. So I think, it's problematic there. What's worthy of note really is that it's not just the international legal system that's under stress because of the decision by Donald Trump and his administration. Trump even bypassed his own Congress because, he didn't declare war, but he launched this, for this conflict, this war, without congressional approval. And we know that, it's only Congress under the US Constitution that can declare war. So there's no authorization for the use of force, really, that way. Now, even previous administrations, they've gained some form of authorization from Congress, whether it was going into the Gulf or it was Afghanistan, Iraq, any of these things. So really, the accountability gap isn't really just international. It's also, constitutional within the US, and it's also a domestic legal issue as well.
The United Nations hasn't been able to do much either. The UN was built to reduce conflict, create forums for diplomacy, and uphold collective rules. But Trump appears willing to only use the UN when it suits him and ignore it when it does not. And now, many countries are also hesitant to confront Washington directly at the Security Council because they fear blowback from the US. So even when other governments believe Washington is breaking international law, they often stop short of mounting a serious challenge. That means the UN, in practice, is struggling to act as a real check. Instead restraining power, it is often reduced to watching it.
We are witnessing a fragmenting global order and increasing disregard for international rules and norms by big and regional powers. In fact, the use of hard power by countries, which is the use of military force, has become all too frequent in pursuit of a might is right approach. President Donald Trump is, of course, reinforcing and sharpening these trends and pushing the world into a Hobbesian state of lawlessness. But he isn't the only one, because the trend has already been there before his assumption of power. Today, the world is increasingly become one ruled by impunity. This era of impunity is reflected not just in the US assault on Iran and, of course, its kidnapping of the president of Venezuela, but the genocide carried out by Israel in Gaza, its military attacks on all its neighboring countries, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and of course India's military strikes against Pakistan last year. Now, none of these powers thought their actions entailed much cost, and they haven't faced any international accountability. So if international institutions were designed to deter and check such behavior, then that isn't happening in today's no-rules world. Multilateralism and multilateral institutions have been under stress for well over a decade, but the attitude of big powers, especially Trump's conduct, has accelerated this trend and magnified the pressure. The UN's paralysis, in fact the UN Security Council's paralysis and ineffectiveness is evident from its failure to stop the genocide in Gaza, stop the US and Israel in the war that they have imposed on Iran, Russia's war in Ukraine, and of course, other conflicts such as the one in Sudan. Its growing irrelevance is laid bare by its role as a bystander in wars and crises, unable to perform its core responsibility, albeit due to big power politics and clashing interests. The result is a loss of faith in multilateralism, with trust in global institutions, including the UN Security Council, which has the primary responsibility for the maintenance of peace and security, at an all-time low.
Now the rest of our world can only push back to a point. Some middle powers, especially in Europe, have pushed back to Trump's threats against Greenland. But when it comes to Iran and Venezuela, European governments have largely failed to condemn the wars in any meaningful way. That has exposed a wider double standard. Strong language when the conflict hits Europe, but much weaker resistance when it hits the Middle East or the global South. Other powers have also been cautious. China and Russia have criticized breaches of international law, but avoided direct escalation. India and several BRIC states have stayed mostly silent, preferring strategic ambiguity over confrontation with Washington. So yes, other countries can create fiction, but they cannot impose a veto. This is where many observers are the most alarmed. Congress has not meaningfully constrained Trump. The Department of Justice has backed him. The media has challenged him but not stopped him. And while the US Supreme Court did block his use of tariffs in one area of foreign policy, the wider domestic system has not prevented repeated military escalation. That is why this is not just about one war, about a presidency testing how much power it can exercise without meaningful resistance.
Congressional oversight from the United States constitutional perspective. What powers does Congress actually have to restrain a president once military action begins, and why has Congress struggled to assert those powers in this case?
Trump controls both chambers of the U.S. Congress. A Republican have majority, dominating majority in the House, and they also have a very slim, but still a majority in the Senate. So, first of all, you need these two chambers, Senate and House, to adopt a resolution opposing the presidential action. But even that is not enough to actually undo a presidential order or to stop him from pursuing the war. You need much more, a larger strength in the House and the Senate, which obviously the Democrats do not have.
There is a key twist. Trump may have bypassed many legal and political constraints, but he has not escaped market reality. The war is now colliding with the global economy. Oil prices has surged above $100 per barrel after the conflict disrupted flows through the Strait of Hormuz. And the International Energy Agency, IEA, responded by announcing a coordinated release of more than 400 million barrels from emergency reserves. Reuters reported that even this record move has struggled to calm the market because around 20% of global oil and gas supply has been affected by the Hormuz disruption. Reuters also reported that the conflict has pushed crude sharply higher this month, and this prolonged disruption could keep prices elevated even with reserve releases. That matters because Trump pays close attention to the markets. And once oil spikes, the fallout spread fast. Fuel, shipping, inflation, food costs, investor confidence. In other words, the restraint that the law did not impose may be coming from economics.
Becoming the de facto enforcement mechanism. It's not quite enforcement in a formal sense, it's more like a real-time consent system. So you have institutions like the United Nations, or you have frameworks under international law. These rely on consensus, legitimacy, compliance. All of this has become weakened when major powers are involved. Markets, by contrast, operate on capital flight, pricing risk, and liquidity withdrawal. These are immediate and non-negotiables. So what we are seeing right now is that sovereign bond spreads are widening. There is currency depreciation, dollars going stronger. There are equity sell-offs. There are commodity price spikes. Together, these raise the cost of conflict in real times, especially for economies that are globally integrated. So while markets don't enforce peace, they price the cost of war continuously, and that pricing acts as a deterrent signal, particularly for economies that are dependent on external finance.
From a regional perspective, this is not an abstract legal debate. The costs are being felt in Iran, across the Gulf, and throughout energy importing countries already struggling with inflation and economic fragility. So, when people ask whether the post-1945 order is still working, they are really asking this. If the strongest state can ignore the rules, and everyone else is mainly manages to expose rather than enforce accountability, is the system still a rules-based order at all? That is why Trump's war on Iran has become bigger than Iran. It is testing whether international law still restrains power, or whether power now openly defies the law. For more such explainers, subscribe to DawnNews English.